Okay, I think we're good to go, Kweku. So, good evening or good afternoon or good morning, everybody, wherever you are connecting from. It's good to see you here again for the second session of this Ethical Humanitarianism series, which is a collaboration between the Frederick Sauer Institute for Evaluation and the Institute for Humanities at the University of Cape Town. Again, just to remind you that this series is part of a series of discussions around the ethical questions that frame our relationship with the notion of humanitarianism. We have indicated already in the last session, and to emphasize again, that this is a series of exploratory conversations, which we are hoping will allow us, to build a larger and more long-term project. And that these are a series of conversations that are also grounded in questions that the two institutes, FIFE with my brother and colleague Kweku, and myself, Divine, and other colleagues here, issues that we are interested in, and we wanted to frame a project that was not dominated or imposed by funders, but projects that grew out of what we would call a grounded interest or interest on the ground. Last month, we had this seminar series launched by Carl Manhlan, who is here, and Catherine Touré from the IDRC, and also Lucy Kirkland from the University of Basel, and also from one of the Swiss foundation, the Omodili Foundations. There are other series that will be coming over the next months. It holds once a month, usually on the third week of the year. And we have a really good group of really eminent scholars, but also different intellectuals, also head of organizations, and people who've had really deep experience, in the humanitarian field. And it is good also to find some of those colleagues, also joining us today. I can see that Ina is in the room. And I can also see that Merlin, is in the room. So there are many others who will be joining us, in the future conversations. And we really encourage you, to be here. So HUMA is an Institute for Humanities in Africa at the University of Cape Town, which founded in 2010. And we are a place for interdisciplinary conversations. We have a number of different mandates. One, which is just creating space for interdisciplinary conversations. The second, just nurturing scholars. And the third, which is public engagement. We have a series of projects that are running at the institutes, one on artificial intelligence and the ethics of care, another one called FACE, which is about feminist interventions to deal with COVID. And we have a project which is about humanities in Africa, and a fourth project which revolves around issues of knowledge production, which is called Publishing Africa. There are a number of colleagues at the Institute, researchers from doctoral researchers, postdoctoral researchers, other junior and senior research fellows. And we do lots of collaborations across the continent and globally, because we are particularly interested in Pan-African and Afropolitan frameworks. So I want to start by saying Happy Africa Day, whatever that means for you. And I hope you've been participating in conversations across the week. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Kweku also to introduce FIFE.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Divine. And welcome once again to everyone. So I am representing FIFE. FIFE is the Friedensau Institute for Evaluation. We are located in Friedensau University in Germany. And as Divine mentioned, we are two institutes working together, but from very different backgrounds. So we are we are an academic institution in a university, all right, but we have also strong mandates on practical and field research as well. So we conduct evaluations for NGOs, philanthropies, international organizations. We evaluate projects on education, health, humanitarian intervention, development projects, as well as emergency projects as well. Also in technical and vocational education and agriculture. So we have a very broad background in that respect. We also offer technical support to NGOs and organizations. We help also with strategic planning, strategic development and project management as well. So you see, ours is we are both between academic and practice, and that's why also the topic is very, very important to us. So apart from this, we also run short-term workshops for capacity building for organizations and group of professionals as well. And we are closely connected to the International Social Science Master Program from the Freedom University. And we work hand in hand with the program as well. In this particular project that we are running together with Humor, FIFA and Humor are working to highlight these practical but also deep academic and civil issues that we deal with every day. And that's why if you follow the themes that we use for these events are quite topics or words that we usually play with without going deeper into it. And this platform gives us the opportunity to do that. And that's why FIFA is very, very happy and proud to be in this collaboration with Humor as we continue our journey on this series together. So welcome, and thank you for being here as we continue the discussion today as well.
Great, thank you very much, Kweku. We are going to move straight to presenting our speakers, who we're going to hand over the platform to. So we have two really eminent speakers today. My friend and colleague and partner in crime, Jess Albert, who is a senior lecturer at the Social Anthropology department at Northwest University in South Africa. Jess is trained as an anthropologist, both here in South Africa and also in the US. And she's done fascinating work and research in Angola, in South Africa, and she's doing work on kindness, some of which she will be presenting today and engaging us on. Our brother Mahindra Shinamogam, which is a friend of ours, and also somebody with really deep experience of working both in economics and also international relations, both in South Africa and also abroad. He's lived and worked in South Africa and also in Germany, in the US, and many other parts of the world. He's currently Director of Policy and Implementation at the Department of Trade and Industry and Competition and Republic of South Africa. And it is great to have such really people with deep experience and are passionate about transformation also on the continent, you know, to be speaking to us. So we're going to start with Jess, and after that, we'll hand over to Mahindra, you know, to continue the conversation. So welcome, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Divine, for the really gracious introduction. I'm just going to share my screen. I'm assuming you can all see it fine, and unless I hear otherwise. So it's really nice to be here, and thank you for hosting this platform and creating this space. It feels like such a privilege to be, as Divine said, amongst friends. And I'm really interested to hear your reactions to this work. It's the first time I'm talking in this way about a new project that has a long history in terms of my own intellectual development, moving both in South Africa and then Angola, Brazil, Lusophone knowledge systems, engaging with the global north quite extensively in different ways, and really trying to think about what is the kinds of work, and I use the word kind there deliberately with its double meaning, what is the type and the generosity and generativeness of the work that needs to be done in this particular historical moment. So I'm going to start with an image from a paper that came out yesterday with two colleagues in Nature, of all random places to be publishing, but it's so nice and indicative of the shift that is happening in academia, I think, at the moment across the board, towards a recognition that the sorts of received structures that many of us have grown up with are violent and do damage. And the fact that a journal like Nature is actually publishing something like this suggests that there has been some sort of progress. I think largely informed by movements like Black Lives Matter in the US, but also with much deeper histories around how we think, rethink, reflect on the kinds of knowledges and the kind of perspectives and approaches that we as academics and as people working in the broad public employ today. And so this map, as you can see, North is a social construct, and I will be forever grateful for my grade 6 geography teacher who turned the globe on the upside down and said, look, the sneaky thing with European knowledge is how the people who draw the first maps wanted to be closest to God. And we've all inherited a knowledge system that prioritizes certain ways of being. And what this map shows is it's produced by Chris Trizos, an ecologist, and it maps out the extent to which birds, of all things, are named after European colonial scientists. And what you see is that the further away you get from Europe, the more names there are of Europeans who have kind of staked themselves not only in terms of the practical and material acts of colonization, but also in these more subtle structures of knowledge organization. And that's something that I've been thinking with deeply for a long time. What I'd like to do in this paper, and oh my gosh, you see a spelling mistake just as you're presenting, it's terrible, is refer to the Archive of Kindness, not Kindness, and explain the background for this new project that I'm now working on, what it is, what it does. And then at the end of the presentation, I want to speak briefly to the implications of kindness as a pedagogy of hyperlinkages in South Africa. And this notion of the pedagogy of hyperlinkages is something I've been developing as a way to reflect on student populations who have grown up thinking with the internet and constantly reading for connection rather than necessarily for depth, and able to Google things in ways that even my generation, and I was in undergrad in 2005 to 2008, so really not that long ago, but the ubiquity of the kinds of technologies that we have today, even in and recognizing the significance of the digital divide and the many complexities of inequitable access, really shifts the way the knowledge production happens, and the knowledge review, peer review, the kinds of the evaluation and validation of certain kinds of thinking that take place in the world today. So I just want to take a quick step back and explain the origins of this in some of my own work. Now, I did my doctorate in the global north at a very wealthy institution, and I found it really striking there how much basic work needed to be explained. And I'm sure all of you are very familiar with this, that when we go to spaces that are the kind of self-proclaimed experts of all kinds of things, we often find ourselves encountering all kinds of absurdity. And so one of the things that I was really playing with in my doctoral work was what happens when you recenter, what happens when you rethink. And my doctoral research took place largely in Angola and also in the South Atlantic space more generally. So I was thinking with Brazil. And this image was developed for a student conference that we had in 2012, and where many students from the continent really tried to speak out and speak to these discourses that basically erased the knowledge systems that many of us had grown up with, and said, well, actually, you just need to master the American canon. And I had wonderful experiences at this institution and really great training and mentorship. But the experience was also of constantly having to speak against and in dialogue with and kind of try to nuance a system that really didn't want to see certain kinds of knowledge systems that might challenge its own power and dominance. So in that way, and some of the students here who've taken, there's a couple who've taken courses with me on this, around the representation and imagery of the continent of Africa, and just the extent to which even now, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness becomes a kind of powerful sort of representational image for the ways in which Africa is perceived. And if you look today at maps about data connectivity, about opinion editorial writing, I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds of maps that we can talk about where Africa is still largely ignored. And COVID has given us many, many, many examples to think with in terms of the visual representation of the continent. And I'd actually, in between studying in South Africa and going to the States, I had a brief sojourn at Oxford, and Oxford, you know, it's such a wonderful place, and it's such a complicated space because it is all of this colonial knowledge in such a kind of it has to be unapologetic in a way, I suppose. And we can talk a lot about the debates that are going on there with the statue, if that's relevant at the moment. But there was this real feeling that in order to shift anything in the discourse of Africa, there had to be an engagement with the imagination. And at the time, the thing that was possible to fund was middle-class studies. And we all know that these are really topics that the kind of fashions and research, and I would imagine the decoloniality is now kind of coming to its end, but there are these sort of moments where you can think with certain concepts. And when I was doing my doctorate, middle class was kind of the way to not write about suffering, because doing my master's degree, which was in human rights law and humanitarian responses, I thought at the time that I would go forth and become a United Nations problem solver. But I became very cynical in the process of the master's, because so much of it was about a received narrative of Angola in this case, which really emphasized the suffering, the war-torn, the desperate, the heartache, the landmines. And of course, all of that is true up to a point. But beyond that point, there are these very ordinary narratives of just making life and being relatively content and, you know, hoping the kids have a slightly better future than this generation. And so that was the project of that book. And something I've also thought about very carefully is the politics of knowledge access. And so actually, by a complete fluke, today the Portuguese edition came out, and that will be freely available. And if anyone wants a link, I'm happy to send you the PDF. So that just got published today, and it was really important for me that we don't perpetuate the kind of knowledge extractivism systems that we see in the first dialogue. Now, in terms of the archive of kindness, and kindness as a metaphor, one of the things I've done in my teaching on in African studies and various kind of Pan-African anthropology related courses is to think a lot about the space of imagination. And kindness and beauty, and my book is really about beauty. It's about perfume, it's about people dancing, it's about soap operas, just kind of stuff that is not suffering. And it's kind of crazy that it still has to be said in these ways, but I think it is important that it's possible to acknowledge structural violence and to acknowledge the negative, whilst also not making that the lens and the focus. And so I've been thinking about these things, carrying it. And then we came back to South Africa, and my partner in December 2019, 3 months before COVID struck and the national lockdown. And we were in a position where we'd rented this tiny little space that was supposed to be for 3 months, and then we were going to move somewhere else. And then lockdown hit, and we couldn't move. And it was a kind of a bit of a complicated space. There was a lot going on. I'm sure all of you remember the sort of panic of this time. But what landed up happening is about 12 hours before we went into the national lockdown, a stranger who we'd met who owned the house next to where we were supposed to move, and from whose balcony this image was taken, said, well, you know, she was going to spend lockdown at her brother's house because she lived alone, and how about we move in with her, into her house, not with her. And Ivan and I were both astonished by this, because she literally didn't know our last name. She knew nothing about us. We'd spoken maybe for about 6 minutes. But in the context of this crisis, this particular neighbor just said, you know, here's an issue. It's not going to work for you guys to be in this tiny little space for who knows how long, because we were watching Europe at the time extend and extend and extend, and there was so much uncertainty. So she gave us her keys, we moved all our stuff, and we passed lockdown. in an environment that was much more conducive to the kinds of work that we were both doing, and basically was completely informed by this experience of kindness. And having done a lot of theoretical thinking about beauty, about goodness, about the stakes of kind of what one focuses on in terms of the histories of knowledge, I then became very interested in what else was going on. And, you know, I would imagine I'm not alone in having been slightly social media obsessed, especially in those first few weeks of lockdown. And what is going on? What's happening in the world? What are the numbers? What's happening in South Africa? But what I started doing was then recording acts of kindness. And this was really inspired by this particular neighbor, but also by many other similar acts that I started seeing around me. Because at least in South Africa, it felt that for the first time in a long time, everybody was thinking what it meant to be in a particular kind of dwelling, in a particular neighborhood, in a particular space, with particular access to food or resources or employment. And I really do want to emphasize that I think this whole notion of social distancing is a complete misnomer, because really some people were able to socially distance and to physically distance. The misnomer is that social distancing was not something anyone was doing. Some people were able to physically distance and others weren't. And personally, I feel very strongly about data becoming something that is viewed as a kind of human right, because if in a knowledge economy, the requirement for participation in certain kinds of public goods, including education and employment, is reliant on data, then data needs to be treated in the same category as water and air. Now, that's a slightly longer conversation and probably not where we'll go today. But I just set up this little blog, and I was just recording things and sending out messages to people and saying, you know, please send me your stories, and a lot of people did. By the time the first phase of lockdown ended, I had about 700 stories on the blog. And then plot twist, I got employed by Northwest University. I was a postdoc at Stellenbosch for those first 6 months, which made sense with Cape Town. And then a very interesting job emerged at Northwest in the Anthropology department, which was and so far remains remote. And I was able to join an institution at a moment of complete kind of crisis and confusion. And so what I found was that coming in just in the second semester of last year was probably the freest moment in terms of curriculum development that has probably ever existed in any university anywhere, because we couldn't do what everybody expected us to do, and everybody knew that. So there was an incredible possibility of innovation. And, you know, as the newbie on the block, I got the course that other people maybe didn't want to teach so much, which was graphic design. It's an outsourced course for the graphic design department called the Anthropology of Film and Media. And I was very, very excited about this, because it's a chance to think through these internalized imagery that has kind of affected our imaginations. And I feel very strongly that today's generation of students think much more visually than other generations, and that we need to be engaging with this idea of the image as a very conscious act of pedagogy. And so I was able to say to them, well, look, you know, we can't do an exam, and we've managed to sneak through that we're never doing exams in anthropology again, which I think has been a great kind of shift from this pandemic moment in terms of pedagogy. But we needed to do something. And so the students had to then collect 50 stories for the Archive of Kindness. And we did a lot of work at the institution about informed consent, about how you go about gathering stories. What does it mean to work with social media? How do we talk about Pasi Baliaho's notion of biopolitical screens, and how screens actually make life? You know, he thinks with Foucault about the intense ability of the kinds of images we see to actually inform the world. And again, if I were to go back to this slide, it's kind of that difference between looking into a brick wall and then having the space and the imagination to consider different futures. And the students had to then submit 50 stories. And there was a wide range. And so this one, you don't need to read the details too much. It's just for illustrative purposes. This was a fairly innocuous story about somebody having a 21st birthday party. The student did not follow all instructions and did not submit her student number and all of that. Whereas here, you know, you can see a different attempt at at recording the students' work. And also what was particularly important here was that this student really took on the lessons of visual imagery that we were speaking through in the course by at least finding an image of Cape Town. But most people didn't. And I think that this is quite a striking story here, where you have a very sweet little story about a church in Middelburg wanting to raise funds, but the illustration is of the New York Police Department. And the same would apply in many other examples. So most of the stock images that came on the archive itself, despite a huge effort from our part, my part as an instructor, and I was engaging SAFM and various other spaces of kind of active participation and knowledge production, which I think for anyone who has a social media account is already happening. So we may as well link it into the work that our students doing, and they were divided into groups, and they had to share some of this work on radio or social media, other platforms, to kind of also extend their technical skills. But it was really striking to me how stock image databases were still largely reflecting a US and European vision of the world. So that when somebody was writing about a house somewhere in South Africa, the house that was chosen as the illustration was one that I don't know about you guys, but I've never seen anywhere in this region. But nonetheless, we had a really interesting set of stories. And so at the end of the day, there were about 2,000 stories selected. And what I found really striking in terms of pedagogy was the ways in which students wrote to me after the class. And so in the formal evaluations, but also in WhatsApps, emails, the kinds of messages we all get from students. One student said that after doing this work, he wasn't planning to immigrate. Another student said that it had completely changed the way that he viewed the country. There were several students in the class who said that having done this work, they then saw South Africa in ways that they had never even paused to consider before. And when I was evaluating the work, because of course I still had to mark it, we haven't quite managed to do away with the evaluative systems of knowledge yet. But when I was going through them, it really struck me that the shift in orientation, this kind of opening up of a possibility of kindness, of goodness in the world, was something that maybe our learning systems have more of a responsibility to do. Because our students are constantly, responding to clickbait and reading so much in terms of social media discourses and in terms of the kind of Google's algorithmic search results, they often don't get directed towards sources of happiness and sources of sustenance and sources of kindness. And it was really, really interesting how the students worked with that process. And I'll wrap up pretty quickly, but just briefly to say that there was impact there on reimagination both of students as citizens, of the work of this kind of pedagogy of hyperlinkages, and of the need to continue this process of revisualizing certain frameworks of imagination. And so that's led to the book. I don't think I need to go into the details of it now. It will be out in about 6 weeks' time. It's been illustrated by a fantastic young art graduate who was just finishing his degree at the time. This is his first project in the public domain, Jethro Longwe. And then those people whose names you may be able to read helped me select some of the stories. And so they all had areas of expertise and in particular thematic domains, and they then curated the stories with me. And this reflects this kind of pedagogy of hyperlinkages that I'm thinking through, of storytelling in a visual age, of the kind of imagination work, scholarly nuance that is nonetheless accessible, of contemporary thinking that is needed. And above all, it reflects a commitment to the possibility that life doesn't have to be so bad. We help our students think through structural violence, through inequality, through all the things that are wrong with the world. But what really strikes me is sometimes we perhaps need to add a little bit more of the other side, of kind of how do you become a citizen who is hopeful enough to be able to contribute in the world. And I just want to say these are early screenshots. There's going to be quite a lot of editing before the book comes out. So I'd appreciate if this doesn't get shared further than the space, but it gives you an indication of the kinds of stories that the students found that were then illustrated and then will be shared soon. So thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm really looking forward to hearing your reactions and thoughts. I'm just getting the screen share. There we go.
Thank you very much, Jess. We are going to ask our brother and friend Mayendra to.
So my babies join me, well, one of them. So excuse if they start barking or snoring during this call. Jess, that was amazing, and I'm really sorry that I didn't have a great presentation like Jess to share with you, but I hope that I could take you through my thoughts and my contribution to this conversation. Thanks again for inviting me. So when I looked at the topic, it really struck me the kind of these words that was put on that topic choice, because in my daily life and in my current position, I'm in the phase of compromise. I know we're all in compromise generally, our needs and our wants, and how we process our time, what actions we action for the day, and what we don't or forget. So in my tasks, I'm compromised constantly, and in my compromise, I try to keep the humanity of it. So working in a government administration in a country that's heavily burdened with trauma, post-traumatic stress, in a society that is faced with the challenges of the challenges where many people are spent on their kindness and generosity because their own needs or their own desires are not met, where our poor suffer more and often in one day than they can in any other place in the world because of our inequality and our starkness. So in my task of compromise in my day, I try to balance the question of how do I get things done in a way that doesn't hurt anyone, and in a way that allows me to keep my generosity and compromise. So my tasks are generally around industrialization, and I'm tasked with trying to ensure that our country and our administration that we have right now uses the policies we have and the tools to bring about a state of industrialization. But I'm also someone who really cares about the sustainability of our environment and the caring of our commons. And in doing industrialization, I have to think to myself, in creating the jobs that we need to create so that we can get people out of poverty, what are we giving up in that process? And how do we embed the generosity to the future generations and the kindness that we need for those future generations to inherit a planet that is going to be better equipped for them and their existence? But my compromise is also to ensure that in the short term, I have to make do what we have, the capabilities that are around me, and to try to bring about the kindness and generosity that is needed for now, while trying to maintain the future outlook for the kind of industrialization that we need that will bring our society to that better tomorrow. The African continent, in my view, is such a great place to be in this point in time. We're just about to get over, and well, not all of us, but on the continent, because of the variance of the experiences that we have and the variances of what's happening and the differences of our continent. But we are in an exciting space because we do have this kind of hope. There is a hope that there is an ability for us to do things in our continent that wasn't possible before because of the burdens that we had. But then how do we do that in a way that embeds the kind of generosity and kindness that are found amongst Africans on the continent and our shared realities? And how do we then embed the compromises that are able us to get about doing much better and not kind of reliving the past that has subjected us to such inhumane memories and the histories that we share. So in my daily task, I'm also faced on a micro level with the compromises of ego, my own personal ego, to kind of do the work that I'm trying to do and make my bosses realize I'm competent and professional. But then the egos of my colleagues who know that information is king in an environment where sharing of information could bring to your downfall. But how do you get about doing your work and task in a kind, generous atmosphere, balancing all these kind of emotions that arise in a professional space. And I'm sure government space is no different from an academic space or a private industry space. There's all this embeddedness of compromises that we have to make in our daily existence. So when I brought to this conversation, I really thought about the impact that I have and what I want to leave onto this planet, and how do I do that in a way that doesn't compromise my own values? Because in working with industry and working with people that are driven by profit and margins, you kind of get into that realm where you have to ensure that you're really to grips with it. So I've kind of like made sure that I remember what drove me to this kind of work. It drove me to see a better future that my grandparents never realized, and to see that the poverty that we have on our continent is eradicated. And to do that, there are a certain amount of compromises. And I try to balance the interests of those compromises with the stakeholders that I engage with. So if I have a CEO from a major corporation, and I know that that person can help me move the cheese, I have to realize that I have to compromise a certain way, but is that compromise within the realm of kindness and generosity that I want in what I do with my actions, or will it bring me into the forecasting of something bad to happen? I have to experience this and process this quite often with the various kind of industries we deal with, and it's a grounding task, but at the same time, it's quite exciting and challenging to know that the position I'm grateful, and the kindness that I try to bring about in the world doesn't allow my ego to overbalance my colleagues, and I try to ensure that I share and collaborate, because that's what I value as being able to move the cheese. I think it'll be also, I think we're in 1839, and I think that my part of the discussion will be also better placed by getting some questions from colleagues on the call, and I'm happy to receive that and engage in that way as well. Thank you. I hope that the sharing was great, and thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think we've had really, really good presentations and good experiences shared here today. We're going to start taking questions for the presenters today, but I will always, like I do, I have quite a lot of questions. So my last question was my question for Mahendra was actually going to be, how do you navigate between showing kindness and compromising on ethical values? Of course, we know that if you are mean, you can't lose your job for being mean. But if you break ethical rules and values or laws or regulations, that can get you into trouble. So it's perhaps easier to not show kindness and follow. But what happens when you see clear cut line between showing kindness and actually compromising? That when you show kindness, you are actually compromising on ethical values. What do you do? Because I think these are practical issues we face every day, and sometimes might be easy to take the easy way out. Do you take easy way out, as you say, in your job every day? So that's it. That's a question for you. We got, and then to Jess, this is really interesting. I really I'm waiting for the book to read more about all these wonderful stories. I think sometimes we see the world from the perspective of all the bad stories. We need to know these kind stories. But let me ask you, can kindness also hurt? And who and how who can be hurt through kindness, and how can this happen? And if this is the case, then should we pursue kindness even at the expense of hurting others? Now, with these thoughts, let me take two more questions added to this, and then you can answer these questions. So who's on there? Who's on the line now?
Chikazi.
Yes, Chikazi, please go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the presenters for their insightful presentation. My question is to Jess. I like your reflections on the pedagogy of kindness and generosity. And I was wondering if this kind of pedagogy can be translated to our conversations, the current or ongoing conversations on issues like academic freedom, decolonization, and transformation, just to bring about some kind of academic humanitarianism in those conversations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Igezi. Can we have one more question before we move on? So can we have academic humanitarianism? That's the question for you there. So as you reflect on one more question, and then we take the presenter's view on that. Do we have any raised hand? If not, please, let's go ahead and Mahendra and just please take up the questions. I think any of you can start.
I can take it, Jess, if you don't mind. It's okay. Thanks. So the easy way out and rules and ethical compromises. Yeah, being a regulator and being a policymaker, working in this field of policymaker, the ethical realm of what we do is most important. It's paramount. But we have examples throughout history where rules and regulations was used to embody a certain ethic and to prove a point that was true for a certain part. So how do you balance that, and whose ethic and whose values and bring about, and how do you ensure that you're doing the right thing? Yeah, it's not an easy question. It's a question I think that we all face with it in the work we do. But the question is that what is the output of that? So in my field, in my department, and with my minister, the output of our work is what we're looking for. We're trying to drive this economy. We're trying to drive socioeconomic realities to become better. So we're trying to ensure that the output brings about the maximum amount of benefit for the maximum amount of people. And of course, to that, there will be outcomes that are not going to be okay for everyone. And in South Africa, the outcomes we try to balance that are not going to be okay is try to address the historic disadvantages. And those are the ones that we try to balance in the regulatory realm to ensure that we compromise that way. We're trying to say we can have to balance the inequality, and the compromise we make there is that what's been happening in the past would be the kind of sector that's compromised in this positioning of bringing about a better South Africa, looking at the inequality that we have. We recently had the broad-based Black Economic Empowerment Commission went on to review. So let me just give you this kind of anecdotal example. The commission has been applying BEE or the codes of BEE according to the person. So if you applied for as an entity to get a BEE code to up your scale, you would have to get it as a person. You have to give the person's ID number. You would have to give about who's making up this party or corporation. And what that did was that it created unequal Black based empowerment that was going to a few individuals on various entities, etc. And the commission thought it was doing its right thing. But then we had to step in as regulators and say, no, you're not doing the right thing. The broad-based Black economic empowerment is meant to be a group of people, meant to be not for individuals, it's meant to be for a whole sector of society. And so you're now in a battle with the commission who's read a regulator, who's read a regulation a certain way, and you have to prove that this is not the right way. And she thinks, the commissioner, Zondo, thinks that, not Zondo, sorry, I forget her name right now. The commissioner is of the view that what she's doing is correct. And we have to prove to her that that's incorrect. And that's the compromise we make. And the challenge we take is most probably going to go to court, but we've now sent out a practice note regarding that. So we don't take the easy way out. We do fight and challenge this constantly. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mahendra. Just please.
Oh, thanks. So those are two really interesting questions that are quite thought-provoking, and quickly, I'll start with you. So can kindness hurt? I mean, definitely. And I think this was something that I reflected on a lot during the course, because it was also quite risky to have students do something in the public domain immediately. And there were real concerns for me about actually giving them that trust, because of this question that kindness can hurt and that narratives can hurt. And so what I tried to do was scaffold it in such a way that we were able to explore the nuances of kindness and to help students reflect on that. But of course, some did, some didn't. And I've recently decided that I will be taking down the original website quite soon. I'm in the process of taking it down at the moment, because of the fact that, taken out of the context of a class, some of these acts of kindness could hurt. And I think that's particularly true when we think about representation and assumptions behind identity. So although the students presented the work anonymously, they were all shaped by their own socialization. And there are a couple of really cringeworthy stories on the archive about people being like, I gave the car guard 10 Rand, not 5 Rand, was one that really, struck me as something that could be quite problematic if not understood in the context of a class discussion. And so it was really important to use it as a teaching moment, but then also to say, at what point do we say this discourse is also potentially quite damaging? And so partly, I think when we think about humanitarianism as a field perpetuates structures of power as well. And so it's very much linked into these kind of ideas that are often linked to religious structures around who gives what and how do you support the poor and the suffering, and these imaginations of otherness as opposed to wealth, which exist in really interesting ways. And I think it gets to Katie's question about a pedagogy of kindness. And my kind of, I'm going to turn it around a bit and say, what happens if we don't do this? Because it is complicated and it is problematic in certain ways. And there's a huge possibility and necessity, I think, of critique, of saying, how do we not make our students, inflate their egos that like they're being kind and they're telling kind stories and all of this, but how do we help them think through power, social inequality, the fact that no amount of free meals is going to undo the kinds of inequality that we see in South African cities, for example. But if we don't develop a pedagogy of kindness and we don't develop a pedagogy that enables our students to also see the positive in the world, what kind of citizens are we going to produce? And I feel very strongly that the role of universities is to produce citizens who become leaders in a way, especially in a country like ours where so few people have the opportunity to have this kind of middle class certificate and the opportunities that a degree opens. And to allow students to graduate completely cynical and completely angry, I think does a disservice to society, because it doesn't allow them to actually fix the problems. It makes them enraged, and rightly. So it's a very delicate balance. But I think for me, you can't have the kindness without the critique. But I think that the critique without the kindness does a lot of damage to everybody, including faculty members, who are then constantly sort of processing new generations of student rage and student cynicism and feelings of betrayal. So it's a delicate path to work, but my own feeling is it's worth walking. And Northwest is a really interesting institution to do it in, because it has quite a raw history in South Africa, and also 3 very different campuses. So I think I'll stop there, but thanks for those questions.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think that's a very important point you made at the end there, where when we have to even critique how we go about it, it's also very, very important. I find myself several times as a consultant for evaluations and all that, and you find something, and even how you put it will determine whether you are showing some kind of or you're just kindness, or just like a machine working and no human this way. No. So thank you very much, both. I have very interesting questions for both of you again on that. Now, today is Africa Day, right? And South Africa actually represents much of Africa, but South Africa also represents the entire continent, the entire world, if I can say. It's a rainbow country. So if I ask this question, is South Africa a kind place? This is actually a question coming from Divine said I should ask you. Is South Africa a kind place? And is kindness, that's the first part, is kindness synonymous to humanist? And is all kindness ethical? You know, we just talked about, can kindness hurt? Is all kindness ethical? And is it ethical to actually compromise ethics for kindness? What do you guys say to this? You can take any of the I know it's a whole lot of different. So perhaps we start with South Africa. Is South Africa a kind place?
I mean, I'm happy to give it a stab. I would say that structurally not. You know, if you look at the systems, a country that has the kinds of divides that we have, it's very difficult to argue that South Africa is a kind country, whichever way you look at the policy and the history and the experiences. But I would say that South Africans are often kind people. You know, if you look at something like our gender-based violence stats, it's again very easy to become incredibly disheartened. It's, you know, this is not an easy place to experience kindness. But I also think that that's partly because we comment on the bad stuff, but we don't tend to make news stories of the good. And the reality is that if humans are not kind, human society collapses. Because it's these micro kindnesses that actually form whether or not people have any framework of mental health and societal health. And so if we weren't kind, we wouldn't have got through the last 500 years, the last 5,000 years. But does that mean that the country can be considered kind? I mean, partly I'm laughing, I'm like, Divine, yes, no answers. No, I mean, of course not. Is it synonymous to humanist? Of course not. Is all kindness ethical? Of course not. But I think that there are really interesting sub-questions that can be unpacked from those discussions. And for me, it feels like nationally, there's a huge desire for that, because I think we also recognize, like, especially listening to the Zondo Commission and the kind of some of the stuff that's been happening in our courts in particular, if you only focus on that, you become so cynical and so angry that I think it is almost impossible to actually function. And I presume that the goal is not for all of us who can immigrate to immigrate. You know, that there's a feeling of like, if it's that bad, why are we here? Those of us who have levels of education, and I mean, virtually, like, as far as I know, everybody on this call has probably got the skill set to be able to go elsewhere. So we're here for a reason, and we're here because we want to be here. And I think that that's also important to recognize, and really critical for our kind of public narratives. I hope I've answered a bit.
To jump in there.
Good job, thank you. So, but Mahindra, before you come in, please, if you have questions, make your questions ready. We still have at least 8 minutes before we go. We can take 2 more questions. If you don't want to speak up the question, you can just write it in the chat. Mahindra, please. Please
to Jess's point, I think our kindness is compromised as well. You know, when Jess made the story about her neighbor who didn't know her surname, or didn't know, I thought I said, would that same sort of kindness be projected at a certain other individual in a different context, from a different background and a different history, or to that person, to Jess's otherness? Like, would it be to a brown man or a black man, or a brown woman or black woman, the same experience of kindness? And I don't think so. I think in South Africa, it's the society is so traumatized that even your kindness is subjected to a projection of what you're comfortable with and how you're okay with that kindness. And I think to Jess's point about us, we are a kind nation and we're able to get this far. And I think there has been kindness shown to the transition to get here. And I think every day South Africans are aware that they're given that. And I think the continent is aware that it is, I would say in general, there is a kindness on the continent. To be as forgiving for the atrocities, the economic quagmire that we find ourselves is, there's a kindness embedded in here, because we've kind of said we will get through it. We will use your systems, we will use your economic structures, your education systems, and we will fight it on that term, because that's what we're doing. The education system that we've created, the financial architecture, all of that is a Western concept that is imposed on all of us, and we're experiencing it. The kindness we're finding is that we're saying that we're able to accomplish much within the system you've created for us on your terms. We're kind enough to say, we'll work with it. We'll try to show you that we're able to achieve that, because we know for the greater good of humanity and to move humanity forward, there has to be that embedded kindness at one part of the party. If all of us, it's going to be a nuclear annihilation. It's just going to be, and I think that's what we have to do daily in our daily lives. We have to say, like, the compromise of our kindness, of what we're going to do and how we're going to achieve a better good for both our households and our personal being, but also the greater good around us. Yeah.
Thank you very much. There's a question from Carl. Carl wants to know if there's an alternative to kindness. There's an alternative to kindness. So, and the next question is also from Andrew, who's from Andrew, and Andrew is asking what socio-political structures are necessary to permit kindness to be experienced universally. So we have human rights, say a universal factor. Can we have kindness also as that? So if I get the question right, so what socio-political structures are there or necessary to permit kindness to be experienced universally? And is there an alternative to kindness? And let me add the last one, is Ubuntu kindness? You from Ubuntu is a South African expression or a concept, or it's deeper than that. But is it kindness? Is it kindness? So we take these three questions. If there are no any question coming, then we can wrap up with that. So who goes first? Yes, Jess, please.
Sure. I think so. This question of compromise. I think that Mahendra raised a really important point there, that there are always compromises to kindness. And I think that's a necessary complication to the kind of broad questions raised in the chat, where, can we really think about universal socio-political structures for global kindness, global humanity, global kind of warm and fuzzy? Yes, we can at a level like the Sustainable Development Goals, but we all know that in practice, those are ideals that often don't actually touch onto individual people's realities, and that kindness is something that's experienced in much closer proximity, and perhaps that would be an important kind of starting point there. So in terms of socio-political structures, I guess I'll go backwards. I think that if you ask a question like that, you get a very broad answer. And I don't know that those very broad answers are going to lead to much more than a kind of UN branded kumbaya holding hands around the diversity campfire, which is fine. And there's a space for it. And it is necessary at a certain teleological and analytic level to have a kind of sense of like, yes, we must include everyone. It's not just, North America or something making decisions, but the realities of it have to be much more micro. And in terms of alternatives, I think, again, my question is, well, yes, of course there's an alternative to kindness. The alternative is huge suffering, because if we aren't kind, we then land in situations of you can call it violence, you can call it manipulation, you can call it all the negative stuff, because kindness is a vague term. So insert a vague negative term of your choice as the alternative for kindness. But if we, I don't think that many people would choose to live in that space and in that way. So, maybe Mahendra, do you want to jump in?
Okay.
Yeah, so it depends on the lens as well, of like, what is the alternative to kindness? Depends on what is your objective for that day. Are you going to be going into that day to say, for me to get to Z, I'm going to have to go through all these hurdles. And do I have to be kind there? Who's watching when I'm being kind, right? And for many people, like at the traffic stop, it's interesting to observe, whoever dishes out cash and like what that experience is to the person begging for cash, and the person giving out cash. And why do other people not give cash if somebody is giving out cash? What has motivated that person to give that person? Was it the feeling that I need to do that to feel better? Is that person's circumstances going to change? So is there an alternative to kindness in the kind of structure we're in, this market economy? And for different people and different strokes, I would say yes. For an Instagram loving picture posting person, there's all the likes that comes with that, and they would rather take that than kindness, and that's their kindness. And for capitalists, it would be the profit and bank balances. So kindness, I would say that, it depends on the lens you are and what you want from that kindness. But I think what we understand from kindness is a world that's better and experienced better by everyone. And so that the basic needs and the best potential of humanity can be achieved. But how do we go about that? I think as humanitarians, that's a big question in our activities that we do in the chosen professions, that how do we bring about the kind of world we want with taking the compromises that we have to do in our daily jobs and the ethical decisions that go with that to bring about that kind of humanity that we know is possible, but there's going to be a lot of sacrifices to that to get there, and that's the compromises. So how do we able to balance that? So I think the generosity in our actions to reach that point, and we have to be kind to ourselves, because we know that we're doing basic compromises each day of decision making to get to that humanity. But yeah, I think it's a tough question. It's a really tough question. And
yeah. Thank you. Yes, I just.
I'm not sure that it's the right question to ask it so broadly, because really when we talk, a term like kindness is so broad that we're all listening to it and responding to it from our own perspective of what we personally experience as kindness or unkind or whatever. And I think that the broader question, which links so much into the theme of this seminar series, is who do we consider to be human? Because humans are worthy of kindness, and those who are not human in the same way as a kind of inner circles might not be treated in that same response. And so when we think about the individual positionality, and like Mahendra's question around, were I differently positioned in the South African reality, would I receive the same kind of kindness? I think it is an important one, because it gets to these ideas of insiders and outsiders, the stuff Divine's been thinking with for years. How do we acknowledge the people that we have more loyalty to than others? But again, I think we have to be really careful in our terminology and in our thinking to not say that you just add kindness into a social political structure and then everything is fixed, because people have all kinds of agendas and all sorts of plans, and also experience things very differently. So if you were to change one policy or one structure, one person's experience of whether or not that's kind is going to be very different to another. And so at a societal level, I really feel that kindness is experienced in the micro, and that's where I suppose the book project tries to make an intervention, because I'm not talking about, the Oppenheimer Foundation that gave, of course, them giving $1 billion was kind. Yes, you could argue that. But that $1 billion probably didn't change very much in terms of people's individual experiences of humanity. Whereas somebody giving food or a home or shelter, lots of people paid electricity bills, these kind of tiny things, that really shifts somebody's perspective into the world. And so maybe a thought of a definition might be kindness is something that shifts perspectives, and if it has the power to shift the perspective, maybe it's worth celebrating. That's been my kind of benchmark for inclusion, because of course I had to choose these stories, and that was a really interesting experience in the evaluation of kindness. But you can see Divine's camera is on. We must stop talking.
Thank you. Yes, Mahendra.
The question to take away from me is that how do we it's a great fuzzy feeling, as Jess says, and it's a great kumbaya. And if I go to my minister and say, we got to be kind today in everything we do, and got to bring these outputs of kindness, and I most probably would get a whoop, because he's like, this is not a kind environment. We're in an environment where we're challenged, people suffering, and how can you be kind in this environment? So how do we be kind? How do we bring about the humanity that we want and the humanitarianism that we think is possible? And what do you think that I need to do, take away? Like, how do I bring about so that I'm not filled with ego of my colleagues or competition or compromises, but rather the kindness that I think that I want, and I think that the series wants from us to become. Thanks.
Thank you very much to Jess and Mahendra. I think these are very, very, very wonderful remarks as we end the discussion. Unfortunately, we are even past the time, 3 minutes past the time, but we still have some very interesting questions here. I'll just read them. We don't have to discuss them now. But there are questions like, how can NGOs or organizations be checked and balanced with their acts of kindness and the picture of Africa they paint to the world for donors' support? That's one thing. So how do we do that? Then from Andrew is actually bringing back the adverse question by saying that which extent socio-political structures need to be demolished in order for kindness to be universally experienced. I think this is what you spoke to as well, with the understanding that kindness actually needs to start from the individual perspective, the personal level, and then from there we can have the right touch to this bigger meaning of kindness, but also in practical terms. Babakar said that in many instances where our intersubjectivity is spoiled with an abused kindness, don't you think that equity can be a viable alternative to kindness for accountability's sake? So that's also a very interesting question. And we have from Hanifa saying that is there any quality of kindness in the socio-political structure? Are there any quality of kindness in these structures as well? And the last one that I have here is Mahindra said he agrees with what you said, that kindness starts with the self, and kindness is all about being human. And I think right in the discussion, just mentioned something, why these discussions, why this whole seminar? I think one of the objectives is to point out that when we look at humanitarianism and all these concepts, it's as if that taking the people who receive or people who are on the receiving end, there's nothing good about them. It's like as if these people are not kind to themselves. They don't have even any humanity among them. So humanitarianism has to come from outside. And actually, these discussions tells us that within these communities, actually the great effort of humanity. I always make example in my class when I tell students, you see, here people donate to help a cause in Africa or Asia or South America, and they can get a tax refund for that. But when a brother on the continent in Asia takes the other brother or sister to school and pays for this, there's no tax refund for this. So who's doing more human? So you see, these acts of kindness, we need to start recognizing it from the micro level as well. And thank you all for these wonderful presentations. Divine, please take it up from here.
No, I'm just going to close. I think we have had such a rich discussion and engaging conversation. Thank you, Mahendra. Thank you, Jess. And thank you, Akweku. We think we have deepened the conversation further, which is exciting, which is what we wanted to do, because I think it's important, to begin to ask these questions and what it means. I mean, the work that Carl is doing, for example, is really trying to demonstrate how much in terms of interdependency and the work that people actually do on the ground, how much people, particularly on the African continents, contribute, to supporting each other through lots of means that do not count, as either humanitarian work or aid work or, support work. So it's important to deepen this. And thank you very much, for pushing this further. We are going to meet again on the 22nd of June for the Ethical Humanitarianism seminar series. And we will be having Olomide Abimbola, who is Executive Director of the African Policy Research Institute in Germany, and also Merlin Inke, who is the Resource Mobilization Consultant at the WHO Partnership for Maternal, Newborn and Child Health in Switzerland. So thank you all for joining us. We are looking forward to seeing you in June, but also follow more Huma and FIFA activities. And Kweku is on his way to Mali to demonstrate kindness. So see you next time. Yeah, bye.
Thank you all. Yeah. See you.
I've stopped.